Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith. And today, what we are going to cover is completely going to blow your mind, because you may think we're in a modern world or even a postmodern world, but there's a new phenomena happening, and it is the postmodern world,
Right.
which is going to be the topic of today's discussion. What is the postmodern world, or how do we look at the people around us and how they are thinking and acting and make sense of it, especially coming from our Catholic philosophical and theological tradition. A lot of times it doesn't make sense, and so today what we want to do with Dr. Smith is kind of trace out a little bit of the evolution of the modern mind from maybe Kant to modernism to postmodernism to what has been, I guess, just dubbed Popomo,
That's
postmodernism. This is
that's
getting to the
right.
point of just being ridiculous, Dr. Smith. But it's absolutely fast. It's fascinating
Uh,
because we're the modern mind is completely relative with regards to many different things. We've fallen into this complete individualism and subjectivism, and
right.
everything around us is interpretation, right? How do you interpret that?
Mhm.
How do you, so it gets confusing, because then on the other hand, we believe in this kind of, where we take this kind of scientism, not scientific, but
Mhm.
scientism approach to things, where if it cannot be proved, or it can be proved, therefore it's done, it's settled. There's
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
absoluteness about things
Mhm.
that are not necessarily scientific, but we try to apply this kind of scientism to everything. And so it's
Sure.
maddening, I think, for the deep thinking Catholic, of even how to
Mhm.
navigate the waters. So maybe you
Mhm.
can get us started, and just I think going through a bit of the history of thought here,
Mhm.
and the evolution of it, we can maybe encounter our neighbor, our postmodern neighbor, with some charity, but also some understanding of where they're coming from.
Sure. Yeah. So, just to follow up on what you're saying there, I mean, one of the hallmarks that I've run into over and over again in interacting with contemporary culture, contemporary thought, right, is this kind of adherence at the one hand of being very relativistic or subjective about ethical matters, political matters, cultural matters, and at the same time, right, as you say, being very scientistic, very materialistic and reductionist on other matters. And it's like, well, these things don't actually fit together, right? Like why is that? How does this work? I don't get it, right? Like, and so I've tried to over the years develop a way of thinking about this that I sometimes call the bifurcation model.
Hmm.
And I think it kind of brings together the different strains that created our contemporary way of thinking. But before we get to that model, we need to think about sort of like the sources. So to kind
Yeah.
of understand it, it's helpful to think about where it came from. So we have to think about postmodernism, and then we also need to think a little bit about modernism.
Hmm.
I'll try to kind of keep things at a general level here, but with modernism, right, you could be thinking the the heresy condemned by uh, Pius X,
Right.
right? The, that heresy is connected to modern, like philosophical modernism.
Hmm.
It's not exactly the same,
Hmm.
right? There's some differences. Um, one way of thinking about modernism, right, is just to think of as early modern philosophy, starting sort of in the 17th century, moving through the 18th, really culminating, I think, in a lot of ways in the work of Immanuel Kant. Arguable that it culminates some in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Hmm.
Um, but Kant, Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, um, is probably one of the most important philosophers when you're thinking about the modern. And we've talked about him a good bit. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but Kant's great sort of, I guess, insight, you could say, he has two of them, two moves that are important.
Hmm.
One is his separation of the phenomena from the noumena.
Hmm.
That is, the appearances or experience, I should say, from reality. And second is his uh, division of the practical and the theoretical. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Those two moves together, I think, are really key moves. So let's deal with the experience versus reality.
Yeah.
Kant was concerned with certain forms of early modern skepticism, in which it was thought that maybe the objects of experience, how do we know the objects of experience? That was the question there. And what he ultimately came to the view was that the objects of experience are predictable and knowable and definable and intelligible because they are in part crafted by the human mind, right? So here you really have, I mean, really, this is a major move in the history of philosophy. It's called the Copernican revolution in philosophy, where the idea is, we've thought in the past so much about truth being the objects, the mind conforming to objects, right? But instead, Kant says, nope, that's not what truth is. Truth happens when the objects conform to the conditions of knowing in the human mind. Right.
So the mind becomes the measure as opposed to reality, the object itself.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. So instead of having an external measure, right, the mind itself is the measure that determines whether an object is true or not.
Yeah. That should sound very frightening to our listeners.
That's right.
And it is that frightening in reality.
Yeah. And so he would say, look, we can do Newtonian science. We can do all this wonderful stuff, right, about the phenomena. It's about the objects of experience. That's all I mean by phenomena. Because the phenomena is shaped by our own cognitive apparatus, right? So it's intelligible, it's predictable, but we can't know that it's true in itself. That's the key point, right? As we can't know that this is the way reality is in itself, because really the phenomena, what we do science about, for example, is really it's really the objects of experience as can be experienced by a human being. Right. So it's another thing in itself. So you might say, well, this is probably kind of impossible, but imagine experiencing the world like a bat. Right. Bats don't experience color. Right. They experience sound very intensely. Right. So am I right about color, or is the bat right about the colorless world? Well, what we're going to say is it depends on whether what somebody, thinking like this might say is depends on your cognitive apparatus, right? There's no way to get back behind the world as experienced by me with the cognitive apparatus I have, or the bat that it has. Does that make sense? Yeah,
exactly. It makes sense as a theory. It doesn't make sense in real life. Because again, I go back to my kids. I mean, my kids and I, we will look at a thing and they will interpret it completely different. And I am right. They look at a fishing pole and they see, a lightsaber or something, and I'm like, no, that's not a lightsaber. That's a fishing pole. So
Jason, who are you to say?
Yes, exactly. My cognitive apparatus is no better than your cognitive apparatus.
Exactly.
Maybe it can beat your cognitive apparatus up, but
so the thing in itself sort of disappears, fades away, right? Instead, we get the world is shaped by the human mind. The other division that he makes is between the practical and the theoretical. So the practical for him is, it's mind thinking about what should be. The theoretical is the mind thinking about what is. And that's what we were just talking about with the phenomenon, the noumena.
Sure.
Interestingly, right, there is no point of unity between practical thinking and theoretical thinking other than the ego. So this is why he calls the ego transcendental. It floats, so to speak, between the domain of theoretical thinking and practical thinking. So if you want to describe the way the world is, you do theoretical stuff, right? You do Newtonian science, you measure the phenomena, all that sort of thing. That gives you the facts in the sense of what happens. Now, whether those facts are the way the world really is, that's another matter, right?
Yeah,
If
interesting.
you want to think about who should I vote for, should I steal? Should I cheat on my spouse? The facts are irrelevant to that. What you have to think about is kind of the what he's going to call the categorical imperative. I don't want to get too far into this, but
Sure.
there are certain ideas, laws, right, of practical thinking that you need to adhere to that are not derived from the facts.
Right.
So what we have is a radical division between the practical and the speculative here. So there's two divisions, right, that Kant introduces. One between the objects of experience and reality in itself, and two between the theoretical and the practical.
Yeah, and he would reduce like morality to just simply duty, right? That with this categorical imperative, it wouldn't necessarily be just it wouldn't necessarily be even a judgment on my part, right? Or
well, you're going to make judgments, but your judgments need to be in conformity with the principle, the categorical.
The categorical. Okay.
Yeah. What's really key though about the categorical imperative, I remember the first time I was reading Kantian ethics, is I kind of thought he was about to say something about God as the legislator, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting, right? But he didn't at all, right? The key point about the categorical imperative is the law that I apply to myself, right?
Okay.
So we create laws that make morality possible, right? And the number one law I create is that I shall always do only that which is universalizable. That is kind of like a version of the golden rule, you could say, to keep it simple.
Sure.
That's what makes it possible for me to think practically and morally. But very importantly, it's a law that I legislate on my own.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. So that takes us, or that's describing kind of the Kantian view, which is the basis of modernism, not just the heresy somewhere in there,
Sure.
but also just the philosophical period of modernism.
That's right.
What's the movement then into postmodernism?
So postmodernism, I would say, is not directly historically derived from Kantianism. Okay, so I think it's always important when sometimes people see similarities or make associations between modes of thought that where there is a real conceptual similarity, but they mistake that for a historical genealogy.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to be careful about. There are some important conceptual similarities between, I think, Kantianism and postmodernism, but it would be incorrect to say that postmodernism grows directly out of Kantianism.
Okay.
So postmodernism is a departure from modernism in the sense that it rejects individual reason or the sufficiency of individual reasoning, right? So postmodern theorists, there's a long history here. Postmodern theory really develops out of sociology and the philosophy of society. And the basic idea, right, is that individual reasoning is not sufficient for truth, is not sufficient unto itself, is in fact kind of a mirage, right? That is individual rationality. Rather, what we should recognize is that reason itself and thought itself is socially constructed. So if there's one phrase you want to think about when you're thinking about postmodernism, is the one I just used, socially constructed.
Yeah, we hear that all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, so every perspective, every moral norm, every whatever it is, right? Government, view of government, all of those things are social constructions. What do I mean by that? It means that they're developed within a specific historical society.
Yeah.
And that, there are a variety of complex factors that come together, often involving competition for power, that is at work within a society that produces its social constructs.
Right.
So, right now, the one that's most relevant probably to us in our contemporary setting is gender, right? That gender is a social construct right? That it's not related to sex. Sex and gender are totally different things,
Right.
right? But male and female are social constructs, not male and female, feminine and masculine are social constructs, whether you're a man or a woman, that sort of thing. So different society, of course, societies differ, right, Jason?
Yeah. 12th century China versus, 20th century America. I'm sure they looked a little different, right?
That's right.
And so, I mean, you can kind of understand something about this. Like, oh, yeah, different cultures have different settings. Different norms may apply. So, I mean, what's wrong with that?
Right. The problem with it, of course, is are some societies correct and others incorrect? Are some societies more correct and others less correct?
Well, now you're just being judgmental, Doctor.
Right. Is it possible
to
be in a society and see what is in itself, or do we only see it through the lens of our own society and cultural background? The hard edge of postmodernism would say the latter. That is, we can never escape sort of the web of our social relationships and our sort of social habituation to see things as they are in themselves. That's true of our culture and every other culture. And so what we really have is, in any of our thinking, in any of our conclusions, in any of our judgments or interpretations, really are expressions of diverse communities. None of them there's no point from which we could say, oh, this community is more correct than this other community.
Yeah.
They're just different communities.
Right, because there's no standard that we can apply to all communities.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, all standards are socially constructed.
Right. So, to judge a culture, we can't judge, say one culture's worse than the other, or, so that makes it very difficult.
We can express our preferences. We can express them strongly. But that's different than saying, and they are true in themselves.
Yeah. That's a big jump for them. Yeah.
That's right. So you might say, something like the hard edge version that I learned when I was coming up in undergraduate, was science itself, right, is a social construct. Democratic faith, so to speak, is like the faith in democratic institutions. That's a social construct. That sort of thing.
So can you get with the postmodern condition? Can you are you still separated from the thing itself? Where does the truth lie? Is it still in my interpretation, or can I actually get at the object? Is there any objectivity?
So this is where we can kind of see a similarity between postmodernism and Kant, again, although it's not a historical connection necessarily, which is that within a given domain, we can achieve a certain degree of objectivity, right? If we kind of put on the blinders enough and say, okay, well, let's focus on, say, the American legal tradition, right? And then we can have arguments within the American legal tradition, given various background assumptions, right? But we can never get to the law in itself, right? Or whether the American legal tradition is good in itself, bad in itself, or where it's good and where it's bad in itself, right? But you can never get to the in itself, right, question there to answer you. So there is, I think, a certain kind of objectivity, maybe that you could experience, although important to note, if you're going to be a thoroughgoing postmodernist, you might say, well, why are you privileging objectivity, right? What's so great about objectivity? And you'll say, well, what would you say, Jason? What's so great about objectivity?
Well, I would say, I'm trying to develop a standard by which I can judge a particular culture so that I can root out the things that are not necessarily good and improve or encourage the things that would make it better.
Yeah. So you're supposing, Jason, right, that some things are better than others.
Well, yeah, that's just my interpretation, right? Like,
right. They're just different.
Yeah. And so it seems then that politics then is not necessarily like, how are we going to help a society be good?
Mhm.
It's just, how are we going to socially construct this body of people,
Mhm.
right? So I mean, there's no like the idea is the idea of good removed altogether because, or is it just not even talked about because meh?
At best, I would say within very thinly sliced, homogeneous communities, right?
Okay.
You could talk about it that way, right?
Yeah.
But outside of that, sort of, you really can't. And what you really then are aspiring towards is liberation,
Mm.
right? That is what you want, is to allow the diverse communities of discourse within your own nation to have their self-expression, to play themselves
Yeah.
out creatively, right?
Yeah.
In the
Interesting.
interaction of communities, right? Because see, nothing's better than any other community. So like you just have to kind of take your hands off, and they play themselves out.
Yeah. Yeah. So nothing really has pride of place then.
No.
No. So even so even within a given society, a Christian tradition would not have any sort of.
Certainly not.
Certainly not. Yeah, we can agree. Yeah, we can see that. Certainly.
I mean, maybe it's fine for Christians in their houses of worship to do their Christian things.
Yeah.
Maybe within their own little sort of thinly sliced institutions or whatever. But as far as entering into the public square in any kind of normative way, certainly not.
Yeah. Or for even, yeah. And I mean, we're even getting to the point where even somebody's personal Christian faith, for them as a legislature, as part of the legislature, they should really kind of repress that.
That's true. Although I will say for postmodernists, I mean, they take that kind of thing in different directions. At some point, right, you start to say, is this, like, as a political approach, is this really possible, right? Because you do need some common laws at some point, right? But I have seen a number of theorists, espouse a very, sometimes it's called the Quebecois solution, right? Which is to kind of let, smaller units like Quebec be French speaking and do their French speaking thing. And so you kind of get like the Swiss cantons, right? During the Reformation period, right?
Yeah.
Where you say, okay, well, this little canton is going to be Catholic, and this one's going to be
that's right.
This one's going to be kind of Zwingli, and this one's going to be kind of this other version, and so we're all going to be these little pockets, right?
Sure.
And we just don't interfere with each other as much as possible. There's I think there's a little bit of appeal to that, but especially in the kind of pluralistic societies we have, I think the question is the possibility of it. I think that's how they would sort of address the political situation. In some parts, there's a different kind of emphasis, though, that would really kind of, I think, want to displace hierarchies on an ever-evolving basis, right?
Okay.
So within a given society, you might say, well, look, you're privileging male discourse over female discourse. Mm-hmm. You're privileging the discourse of theologians, people who can read Latin, over those who cannot read Latin, that sort of thing, which creates a situation of oppression. And so what we need is just sort of a constant churn, right, of liberation and revolution to allow sort of different communities of discourse to develop.
Sounds great. Liberation, revolution. That didn't work out for the 20th century very well.
The problem, Jason, is we just didn't have enough.
Yeah, we just didn't do it good enough, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, with all of our educationalist models and the socialism or whatever it is, the problem is you just didn't go far enough, right?
Yeah, which you would make a good Marxist happy, I guess, if you said that. Like, right? Yeah, Marx wasn't Marx enough, right? I mean, I don't know.
It was all those damn counter-revolutionaries. Right? around. You know, we could have just weeded them out.
Yeah. The moderate revolutionaries. They just they just held us back.
Yeah, see, that's a problem. Yeah. At some point, you're not radical enough.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
And then we have the guillotine for you.
Yes, so. Yes, yeah. Right. We need to industrialize our our revolutions to make them really effective, right?
Yeah, the gulag.
Right. Yeah.
So of course, I don't think we've really ended up quite there. I think that was I mean, I think there is still kind of the postmodernism, that kind of hard edge of postmodernism, I think has been appropriated by kind of neo-Marxist kind of political movements, cultural Marxism, Western Marxism. That's for another podcast. But I think it's kind of faded some in academia for sure. That is the hard edge of postmodernism. So like when I was coming up in undergraduate, I had a professor who was, taught from a postmodern perspective, had a couple, and both of them talked about science as just one discourse among others. Poetry is just as legitimate a form of discourse as science is in understanding the world. Science privileges is a community like any other. It privileges some ways of thinking over other ways of thinking, and so it's not in itself any better at describing the world than the community of poets. So that was like the hard edge of it, right? Yeah. That I learned. There's, as an iconoclastic undergraduate, there's a little bit of appeal to that, right? It's like, yeah, man, the scientists, man, they're just a community of discourse. What do they know?
Yeah, the arts, right?
But interestingly, I don't think it stayed there, right? And the conversation, and that is the culture.
Yeah,
and a lot of people have recognized that, and that's why we've moved kind of away from I think, or developed from, I should say, the postmodern tradition into what a good number of theorists, for better or worse, are calling the postmodern condition, right?
Look, that's why they need the arts. They need the arts just to come up with a more creative title for like these things. I mean, like seriously, like we've been through modernism, postmodernism. Come on. Get a little creative if you're going to name an entire. It would at least make for a more exciting podcast, maybe. I mean, seriously.
I don't know. Popomo sounds pretty great. I mean,
yeah.
It sounds like it's like a song or something. What was that song you were talking about earlier?
Or the Poconos, not to be confused with the Poconos. That's right. Yeah.
Those are islands. Right?
Yeah,
there's a song about that though too. Like a Beach Boys song. Yes.
I think you're right.
So. Which is definitely not post or pomo. So this is, I think, actually kind of what we're encountering now, and that is where we find and you find this among the millennial generation for sure, but also in some other sectors of society, and that is a really strong doubling down on science, right? Mm-hmm. That is that there's a kind of a reassertion of science here, and of the importance of science, and not just its importance, but it's the exclusive way of relating the facts.
And right. I think maybe a good way to look at it is when we looked at postmodernism, there was no privileged discourse, right?
That's right. Right.
And postmodernism, science is the privilege. Is that? Am I correct in saying that, or?
I think so, but you would just want to be careful in saying that within a limited domain.
Within a limited domain, yeah.
So if what you're trying to do is describe the facts of the world,
yeah,
right, then you talk to a physicist,
right.
If what you're trying, or a chemist, right, or an evolutionary biologist, if you're trying to talk about meaning or purpose or value,
yeah,
culture or politics or art, don't talk to the scientist, right? I mean, the scientist can maybe tell you about the chemical composition of things, right?
Sure.
And and within his own domain might be rather reductionistic, but it's not as if a contemporary man wants to say, "Oh, and science can tell us our politics."
Right. Yeah.
Science can tell us everything. It can maybe give us some information, some data, right? But it doesn't translate over to
Hmm.
necessarily politics. Now, to be honest, I kind of agree with that, right? I mean,
Right.
I think
Yeah.
scientists can't actually tell us uh, about what's morally good
Yeah. Yeah.
or about what's politically wise. Um, I think philosophy and revelation do that, but the but they do within this postmodern condition, they do have privileged discourse about being, about reality,
Yeah.
right? So what isn't caught by this net of science just isn't.
Right.
Right now, that's going beyond what like science. It's a philosophical position about science. But basically, if you want your ontology, talk to a physicist.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. So maybe yeah, and I would say, I mean, if you wanted to maybe see a cultural example of kind of the postmodern world or condition, would be to look at, and correct me if I'm wrong or mistaken, would be to look at how some view, say, they almost hold to the climate change issue as almost they hold to it religiously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you even have some. I mean, they were even, when we had those ridiculous examples of people in I forget what kind of church it was, where they were up at the altar confessing their sins to the earth. You know,
Mm-hmm.
again, putting science in a place that of course I would say doesn't belong in
Mm-hmm.
that way, but maybe is that a good example of kind of this, or at least the logical consequences of
Mm-hmm.
postmodernism.
Sure. I think what you would want to unearth there as well is what are the moral ideas, right? What are the ethical concepts
Mm-hmm.
that are at work in making you have these concerns about these facts, right?
Yeah.
So science can't tell you you should be concerned about global warming. You should stop global warming. You should not contribute to global warming, right? Science, all of the scientists can really tell you is global. Well, if science said this, but we'll just say by hypothesis, supposition, that I guess it's now, what's it called now? It's just global,
Or
not
climate
warming,
change
climate change, right? So weather's changing.
every
So
day.
there's the so there's climate change, and it's caused by human beings,
Right.
and it's going to have negative effects. I guess that's
Yeah.
the current kind of state of that. But then, like, oh, we should be really concerned about that, right? So that's a different kind of set of ideas. Does that make sense, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
science on its own doesn't generate you should save the earth, right?
Right.
Yeah, that has to come from something else, because you could just say I agree with all the science and I don't care. Right? Now maybe that would be a bad or irresponsible stance, right?
Sure.
But it's not logically incoherent, at least in terms of postmodernism or modernism, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now would they go so far as to say that um morality is a social construct,
Yes.
and the way that our society should work is that science should be the starter, or the science should dictate maybe our morality. So like the
Mhm.
climate change example, like I should care because science is telling us this. If science
Mhm.
wasn't telling this, then if
Mhm.
there's like science doesn't really talk to us about adultery, therefore
Mhm.
I'm not really going to pay much attention to the morality of adultery.
Sure.
But
Sure.
science tells me about climate change, so does that make sense? Like, do you think they would
Sure.
maybe or at least pick up their first clues about morality from the science world?
I think the scientific inquiry in that way would be the occasion
The occasion. Okay,
for
is that it? Okay.
moral angst. um, but it wouldn't be sort of the norm, right?
Yeah.
In itself.
Right.
Um, because that's at the end of the day, even with something like climate change that people have a lot of moral angst about, um, it what science is telling us is just a description of facts, right? It's just this stuff is happening,
Yeah.
right? And then how you interpret it, how you react to it ethically within, again, a postmodern condition or a post-postmodern condition is not derived directly from science.
Yeah, right.
Right. So science is privileged in the sense of telling us, there's no soul, there's no afterlife,
Right.
there's no God or gods, those sorts of things, right? Because what's not caught by the net of science doesn't exist. But it can't really tell us and this is how you should live.
Yeah.
That's for our own creativity, our own collaboration together within society.
Yeah.
That's the domain of creativity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, like if you take some of the things we talked about in our last podcast about pessimism,
right,
and
sure.
And kind of look at when people make the movement, and you hear this all the time in politics where they go from well, I to we, and I think that's kind of we see that all the time within the realm of like modern morality,
sure.
well, we Americans, well, what is who's saying that? There's a huge there's a huge swath of people
sure.
within that do not fall within that. So so yeah, that or at least when it comes to morality, yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
I think I have a diagram I'm going to put up on the screen here.
Yeah.
That I think helps kind of bring this together. So you might be asking yourself, so we talked about Kant earlier. Where does Kant fit into all of this? Is that up on the screen there, Jason?
Sure is.
Okay. So I think Kant gives us a way of thinking about the combination of these two things, right? That's useful. I think one of the permanent, even though there's not a direct historical chain from Kant to postmodernism, I think there is a kind of Kantian inheritance that's just part of the modern mind.
Yeah.
Right. And that Kantian inheritance is the division between experience and reality, and the division between the practical and the theoretical. Right. Those hard divisions, I think, are just part of the modern way of thinking. Even if it's not historically connected directly to each later idea, it's just part of our inheritance now. Right. And I think that the way postmodernism and scientism are coming together in our contemporary discourse, in our contemporary conversation, is reflected by, or is a reflection of this practical and theoretical division, but kind of rethought in terms of objective and intersubjective, right?
Okay.
So if you're watching this on YouTube, if you're listening on podcasts, you can just kind of imagine it. Maybe we can put this slide up, Jason, in the show notes.
Yeah, check the show notes, or for our listeners, check out the YouTube video as well.
Okay. So if you think of, we have kind of two different ways of thinking, right? We have a way of thinking that is dedicated to objectivity, that's dedicated to the objects. And then there's another way of thinking that's dedicated to the subject, right? That is the I. What am I going to do, or what are we going to do, right? There, we're not just trying to analyze, right, or describe.
Right.
We're trying to decide. We're trying to commit. We're trying to promise. We're trying to avoid something or to achieve something, right? That would be on the more subjective side, right, of things, right? So we can talk about objectivity, where we're interested in objects, or we can talk about subjectivity, right? So if we're going to go with the objectivity side, right, that's where we're exploring, to use Kantian language, what is, right? And there, I would say, what we have basically is a kind of, that's where scientism, right, plays itself out, right? This is where the ontology of the world, the reality of the world, is determined by what science can say about the world, right? So if you want a objective description of things, you ask the scientist, right? These are the facts. We can make this very clear with an example. If you want to talk about the human body in its physicality, in its biological aspects, right? We have a way of doing that. We can talk about the body objectively,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
And scientists and biologists can help us to talk about the body objectively,
Right.
right? As to, the liver has to work a certain way, you have kidneys, your eyes. Obviously, there are what we call the primary sexual qualities, right? Those sorts of things, right? That are objectively reported and described within biology.
Mm-hmm.
So in the center of this diagram, I have the ego. So when I am thinking about objects objectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is, I'm letting my focus be sort of absorbed by them, right?
Right.
That's when I follow the scientific method. Okay. But there's a whole nother activity where I turn away from the object and I think, what am I going to do? Right?
Mm-hmm.
How is this subject going to enter into the action, enter into the world? Right? That is a different stance, right? Because I could just choose to ignore those scientific facts.
Right.
I could do all sorts of things that might be informed by the scientific facts, but aren't determined or fixed by the scientific facts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I might kind of have them in mind, right? But that they don't sort of fix my course of action or my way of being in the world. Very importantly, this is still under the influence of postmodernism, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I've been talking about the subjective, but really what we have found, so postmodernists would say, is the subjective only exists and emerges within the intersubjective, right? So if I sound like I'm speaking in kind of weird ways
here, you are.
I'm trying to reflect, right?
Yeah.
Their way of speaking about it, which is to say, right, that I only find myself as a subject, as an I acting in the world in relationship to other subjects, right?
Yeah.
And again, there's a grain of truth to that, I think. No, but of course, what happens is they take it too far, right?
Yeah.
But this is, so instead of objectivity versus subjectivity, what we need to think about is objectivity versus intersubjectivity.
So it's not a complete kind of individualism, but it's an individualism that's in relationship to other individualisms, kind of.
That's right. Yeah, so, that's one way of putting it. It's a subjectivity.
Yeah.
That's related to other subjectivities. Okay. Never independent, never on its own. Right? It's always with others, in relationship to others. I think this is really fascinating because, again, there is a grain of truth to it.
Sure.
An important one. But what they want to say is, right, in our intersubjectivity, we craft together purpose, value, and meaning. We do not discover purpose, value, and meaning.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Discoveries are made by scientists acting objectively, and all they can uncover are the facts. Those are important facts, right? But they are not the purpose of things, the value of things, the meaning of things.
Right.
The purpose, value, and meaning of things is discovered subjectively, right?
But not just individually. But this, so you're moving from kind of an individual relativism to kind of a cultural relativism or community organized relativism. I mean, I
think it's a community. It's a kind of relativism that is recognizes our dependence, our embeddedness within a given historical community, right? And that often we are individually members of overlapping communities, right? Different communities, right? Which I think is kind of interesting as well. I mean, you can think about the way our identity, so think about the way your identity, right, shifts depending on your social context.
Yeah.
Form of self-expression within your social context, right? The way I behave at the grocery store, right, is quite different from the way I behave in church or when I'm in a church-like setting, right? Which also would be different than the way I behave, say, at say maybe a dinner party held at a secular university, right?
Yeah.
Those are all going to be different. Those are different kinds of communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And different kinds of things are going to be said and expected and all that sort of thing, right? See, our identity, how we describe, how we would sort of see ourselves, define ourselves, and express ourselves changes within those intersubjective contexts, is the way that they would say it.
Yeah, but you don't change. Like, you're not, it's not like you're Dr. Smith and then you're not Dr. Smith. Like, you are you, you know, like.
All right, well, yeah, but maybe, but okay, so let's go with the Dr. Smith part, right? I don't have my children call me Dr. Smith.
You should. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, right.
You know, like, you know.
No, but what I'm saying is, and
that
you know,
doctor part of me kind of is what this is how they would say it. You know, the professor drops away and the dad takes over.
Yeah. No, it's not. Yeah.
You know, and say the businessman maybe who's praying on his knees with his fellow parishioners in church one day and then firing them the next, right? He has a different, you know, one point he's a brother in church with other Christians, and the next day he's an employer firing those same Christians.
Yeah.
And so, see, the identity changes there. So, I mean, this is the way that kind of
sure
approach plays out. Yeah. So, I think it's interesting. One of the things about intersubjectivity. So, this is us trying to figure out. Notice I keep saying us. We're trying to figure out what we should do.
Yeah.
Right, together. This is not, again, us discovering the true good together, right? But this is us crafting, right, purpose, value, and meaning. So let's go back to an example I used a little bit earlier about the body. If we want to think about the body objectively, we talk to the scientist. If we want to talk about the body in terms of its purpose, its value, or its definition, then we have a conversation together, right?
Yeah.
We have a conversation together that's informed by our diverse communities and perspectives, our diverse values and aspirations, those sorts of things. And we collaboratively, right, create, not discover,
right,
the purpose, value, and meaning of the body. The body has no inherent or intrinsic purpose, value, or meaning, right? We create, right, an interpretation of the purpose and value and meaning of the body together.
Yeah.
In discourse, dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to point out. Like, you can totally see this in our modern culture with the amount of importance of, you know, where you hear phrases like, it's so good that we're having this conversation, or thank you for starting this conversation, or dialogue is what we need. That, you know, that we've kind of placed dialogue and conversation in kind of the place of God, which
well,
or maybe we have. I won't even say it's like we have.
Or maybe just in above demonstration and refutation.
Yeah, and that's the other maddening part about this dialogue or thing, is that it's not refutation. That the kind of the parameters of this dialogue is that everybody is heard and everybody's, you know, we kindly nod at everybody, and
what's important here really is affirmation.
Yeah.
Friendliness, mutual support, mutual recognition and respect.
Yeah.
Right. All those sorts of things, which of course, I mean, there are reasons to be friendly and reasons to be mutually respectful.
Sure.
I think we have to ask whether these are the highest matters, and also whether or not those are the things that drive our interpretation of purpose, value, and meaning.
Okay? Yeah, exactly.
So it's, you know, in order to have a go to your point, in order to have a good conversation, you need to be respectful.
Right.
But being respectful for someone else doesn't determine my definition of what it means to be a human being, or the definitions that are appropriate to the human body. Do you understand?
Yeah.
What I'm saying? So I could be respectful in conversation, but see, that would be, for me to want to refute someone else's definition would be I would be denying them recognition, right?
Yeah.
I would be, instead of being in a position of intersubjective harmony, intersubjective affirmation, intersubjective, dare I say it, love.
Yeah.
What I am, and then is exploitation, denial, and domination. And that harms. See, that harms you, because I'm not allowing your understanding,
Yeah.
right,
Well,
of purpose, value, and meaning to be developed and expressed.
well, maybe all of these dialogues, maybe a good remedy is that all of these dialogues and discussions should begin together with a general announcement, or maybe even a community recitation of the principle of non-contradiction. That, you know, if we're discussing something,
this is great. This is great. So this is what's so great about this picture, the bifurcation model, right?
Yeah.
The law of non-contradiction applies to objectivity.
Yeah, sure.
Just doesn't apply to intersubjectivity.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're looking at the model there, the small line that Dr. Smith has between intersubjectivity and intersubjective and objective, that line that goes down the middle, the vertical line, that needs to be a little bit bolder, I think, because it's a hard line between those two realms. Yeah.
And here's a really fascinating thing. This is, again, another Kantian holdover. It's a reinterpretation of Kant, but the only unity between the intersubjectivity and objectivity is the ego. It's just the I.
Just the I.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, which itself is neither fully defined or captured by the objective or the intersubjective, right? Kind of plays in between the two.
Plays in, yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh, this is maddening.
So I think, I don't endorse this way of thinking.
Yeah.
Or close. But I do think that this is at least a fairly accurate or useful model for understanding the way the contemporary mind strangely combines this sort of fanatical adherence to science and a kind of relativistic subjectivity.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it does. And I think for us and our listeners, like, this is pretty valuable. And when we're trying to talk to somebody, we can't assume that they have the same kind of starting point that we do with regards to knowing, deciding, acting, or reality. Sadly,
right.
Oh my gosh, how do we even talk anymore? But but this gives it away that, okay, so the modern person that you're talking to is probably okay mentally, intellectually, of having this strict line between the subjectivity of purpose, meaning, value, and the objectivity that science can provide to the things of the world. That and that's okay. Like, to them, like, that's okay. We can have this this interplay, and the twain shall never meet. Right. So
that's right. And then, they might not be able to. Just so it's okay if we go just a little bit long here. They may not be able to say, "Oh, well, I believe in a hard division between intersubjectivity and objectivity." We're not going to say it that way, right? It's not as if they they're trying to wed Derrida and Francis Bacon. But that's nightmarish. But anyways, but they've inherited.
Yeah.
Or maybe are influenced by this way of thinking, right? So the facts are over here, value, purpose, and meaning are over here.
Yeah.
And the two just have no connection. I just want to say a couple things quickly by way of refutation here, criticism.
Sure.
And then we can move forward. We can wrap up. On the subjective side of things, right? Postmodernism is a self-defeating sort of discourse, right, or theory, right? It says that everything is every interpretation is a social construct, and they're therefore not true in itself. That's true. Postmodernism itself, right? Postmodernism is a social construct. Oddly, people in Kenya don't ever. They're just like, this is not a thing that happens. Like outside of the Western, kind of the Western world for the most part. There are some exceptions, but this kind of postmodernism is just self-defeating, right? It is itself an expression of a historically situated society, right? and it's only seems appealing within the parameters of that society, right?
Right.
So that way, it isn't actually a good explanation of interpretation. Secondly, scientism in any sort of strong version, right, is again self-refuting.
Yeah.
Right. There is no scientific proof that only science gives us reality, and therefore scientism defeats itself, destroys itself. These kinds of refutations sound maybe sort of trivial to people, but they just keep being true. So this is the thing, right? and against this mountain of sophisticated language and rhetoric and all that sort of thing, some of which I actually find sort of oddly fascinating, you can just kind of come back with a good old dialectical hammer and knock it down.
Yeah.
And it shows you, I think, in some ways, the foolishness of man. Jason, you'll have to maybe remind me of the scripture, particular verse, but thinking themselves wise, they became fools. Is that Romans 1?
Yeah. That sounds right.
And it's like, yeah, man, this is all so sophisticated, and intelligent, and thoughtful, and wow, it's incoherent at the end of the day, right? it's this mass, right, of sophistication built on an incoherent foundation that can't stand. The last thing I'll say, and this is a little more complicated, is the bifurcation model itself, in which we have the transcendental ego that provides a unity between objectivity and subjectivity. What I want to ask is, from what perspective do we know that the ego unites intersubjectivity or objectivity, right? And I don't think there's a real answer to that, right? That is, it's just this is a picture, right, that can't be given to us by science, right? And if we're stuck in intersubjectivity, we can't know that this is the way the ego is in itself. And so there's no good reason or foundation for thinking the ego provides a transcendental unity between intersubjectivity and objectivity. I hope I never say that sentence again.
Or that you can apply that universally. Like,
yes, exactly.
There's that. Yeah, again, goes against. I can just say,
it collapses on itself.
Yeah, that's your cultural. Your cultural construct of how you think the ego interacts with this. But who are you to?
A 13th century knight from France is going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about with the
he'll just stab you and right off in the sun.
Clearly witchcraft.
Just simply the simpler times. But all right, folks, well, we've reached the end here. So I hope this helps our listeners at least understand some of the thinking processes that take place within the modern mind. We can't simply just, I think, set people aside and say, well, they don't know, or they don't get it, blah, blah, blah. No, try to understand how it is they're thinking, because that may be some of the preliminary work, or some of the work that we need to do first, is to pick apart some of the way that they've constructed their own thinking, to challenge them on these things before we get into other things, whether it be philosophy or the gospel. And so I want to thank all our listeners for joining us today. In the meantime, check out all of our stuff over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Check out our courses there. And until next time, God bless.